Welcome to the deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you with us today because we're looking at something that feels like it belongs in a high tension thriller.
No, I've
But it actually happens every single day in hospitals around the world, and we are pulling our insights today directly from a really fascinating primary source. It's a medical video transcript titled HCC 1475-17C Hot Snare Pedunculated Polyp, and that is straight from the YouTube channel of Dr. Gautamukala S. Raju.
Yeah, and it is a remarkably detailed look right over a surgeon's shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we're doing today is unpacking the incredibly tense, highly precise choreography of removing a complex polyp from the human colon.
Right.
I mean, this isn't just a simple medical walkthrough. We are looking at a masterclass in physics, spatial awareness, and really unspoken team dynamics.
It really is. When you go through the source material, you start to realize this procedure is essentially like diffusing a microscopic bomb inside a tiny, dark, winding tunnel.
That's a great way to put it.
It requires this perfect blend of anatomical knowledge and understanding of electrical currents and a totally synchronized team to pull it off without a hitch. But to kick things off, let's just set the stage for you listening. Why is this specific scenario so uniquely challenging compared to, say, a routine screening?
To understand the stakes, we really have to look at the specific type of target in the colon. The source focuses on what is called a pedunculated polyp, located in the sigmoid colon.
Okay, pedunculated.
Yeah, it's a big word. But the term pedunculated simply means that the polyp has a thick stalk. It's shaped very much like a mushroom.
Got it.
And the danger doesn't necessarily lie in the head of the polyp, but rather in that thick stalk.
Yeah.
Because it contains multiple, surprisingly large feeding blood vessels.
And because of those large blood vessels, the risk of severe bleeding is incredibly high. Like if a doctor were to just go in and snip it off mechanically, it would be an absolute disaster.
Complete disaster. That is exactly why a standard cold snare is totally out of the question here.
Which is what they usually use.
Right. A cold snare is essentially just a mechanical wire loop used to guillotine smaller, flatter polyps.
Yeah.
It simply will not work on a stalk this thick and vascular.
Yeah, it wouldn't seal anything.
Exactly. To safely remove this, a hot snare is absolutely mandatory. And a hot snare uses electrosurgery, meaning it runs a specific controlled electrical current through the wire loop to basically burn and seal those blood vessels at the exact same time it cuts through the stalk.
Let's unpack this setup, because reading through the source, the preparation sounds exactly like a pre-flight checklist for an airline pilot.
It really does.
Everything has to be perfect before you even take off. First, you have the patient, who has to be physically connected to the electrosurgical unit. They place a basically a grounding pad on the patient's loin, which plugs into the neutral socket of the machine.
Right.
Then, the active hot snare tool itself plugs into the monopolar outlet.
And this setup creates a complete electrical circuit right through the patient's body, which brings us to a critical rule of spatial awareness that Dr. Raju emphasizes right away.
The machine placement.
Yes. The electrosurgical unit, the machine generating this high-voltage current, must never, under any circumstances, be hidden behind the endoscopist. It has to be positioned directly in front of him.
I mean, I imagine in a high-stakes moment, you cannot be turning your head or guessing what the dials say.
Not at all. The vital parameters and settings that dictate how the electricity is going to behave inside the patient's body must be completely, instantly visible in the doctor's direct line of sight. Any deviation or error in those settings could cause immense harm, so visual confirmation is just paramount.
And speaking of things being exactly where they need to be, the source points out a highly practical, real-world detail: the foot pedal.
Oh, the blue pedal.
Yeah, specifically the blue pedal used for forced coagulation. It has to be placed perfectly right at the endoscopist's foot before the snare is ever even inserted into the endoscopy channel.
Because if we connect this to the bigger picture of the procedure, picture the moment of truth. The doctor has successfully navigated the scope through the winding curves of the colon, found the polyp, and carefully maneuvered this tiny wire loop around the thick stalk.
The tension is at its absolute peak.
Right. The very last thing the doctor can afford to do is start blindly fumbling around with their foot on the operating room floor, trying to find the pedal to activate the current.
It would be like trying to find the brake pedal in your car while you're already skidding on ice. You need your foot hovering right over it from the very start.
Absolutely. And alongside this physical preparation is a strict protocol for verbal communication. The source highlights that the assistant must verbally confirm the exact machine settings out loud to the entire room.
Reading it off like a flight manifest so everyone is on the same page.
Exactly.
They call out something like endocut Q313, force coagulation effect 2, 25 watts. Now, when I first read that, it sounded like a foreign language. What do all those numbers and settings actually mean in practice?
It is essentially a recipe for how the electricity is delivered. Endocut Q refers to the specific pulsing mode of the current. It alternates between cutting and coagulating.
Okay.
The 313 and effect 2 dictate the duration of those intervals and how widely the heat spreads into the surrounding tissue. Finally, 25 watts is the raw power behind the current.
Which seems highly specific.
It is, and the source notes that while Dr. Raju prefers 25 watts, there is variation globally. Japanese endoscopists, for instance, have been known to use higher wattages, sometimes between 30 to 35 watts.
So there's some personal preference in the raw power, but is there a universal rule they all follow?
Yes, the non-negotiable rule across all of these preferences is that they must rely heavily on coagulation current, not just a standard cut current.
Wait, so why rely so heavily on coagulation current? What actually happens if they accidentally switch it to the standard cut current?
Well, think of a standard cut current like a scalpel. It is highly focused and vaporizes cells instantly to slice clean through. If you use that on this thick stalk, you slice right through those big blood vessels without sealing them, resulting in an immediate hemorrhage.
Yikes.
Yeah. Coagulation current acts much more like a welder. It delivers a different waveform of electricity that forces the surrounding tissue to heat up slowly. The proteins denature and melt together, fusing the blood vessels completely closed before the mechanical force of the wire actually severs the tissue.
Okay, so we have the machine set up, the pedal is under the foot, the settings are locked in and announced. Now we get to the actual physical tool, the snare itself. For you listening, imagine a long, flexible plastic tube or sheath. Inside that tube is a wire.
Right.
And at the doctor's end, outside the patient's body, there's a handle with a thumb ring and a slider. When you push the slider forward, the wire gets pushed out of the far end of the plastic tube inside the colon and forms a loop. When you pull the slider back, the loop pulls back into the tube, closing tight like a lasso. It sounds simple enough, but the source reveals this brilliant safety hack they use before they even start.
It's a wonderful example of practical ingenuity. Before the procedure begins, the assistant opens the snare completely in the air. Then, they gently close it, pulling the slider back, but they stop the exact moment. The tip of the wire loop is perfectly flush with the tip of the plastic sheath.
So the loop is completely gone, pulled just inside the rim of the plastic tube.
Yes, and at that exact position, the assistant takes a pen and places a physical, visible mark on the metal slider handle.
Which begs the question, why go through this arts and crafts step with a Sharpie marker in a high-tech operating room?
The genius behind it is all about dealing with the unknown variables inside the human body. Let's say the endoscopist is looking through the camera at this polyp, and they estimate the stalk is about 8 or 9 millimeters thick. They maneuver the open snare over the polyp and tell the assistant to close it. The assistant pulls the slider back until the wire grabs the stalk tightly. At that moment, the distance from their physical Sharpie mark to where the slider is currently resting should perfectly correspond to that 8 or 9 millimeter thickness.
So if the slider shows 8 millimeters of distance and the doctor estimated an 8 millimeter stalk, everything matches up. The math checks out.
Exactly.
But what happens if it doesn't match? Because if you're picturing the inside of the colon right now, remember it's not a straight, smooth pipe.
Far from it. The colon is full of complex curves, tight bends, and loose folds of tissue. When you throw a wire loop around a polyp in that dark, curvy environment, there's a very real danger that you might accidentally trap an extra fold of healthy colon tissue inside the loop, hiding behind the polyp where the camera can't easily see it.
You think you just have the stalk, but you've actually lassoed a chunk of the colon wall, too.
Exactly. And if you have done that, the loop won't be able to close as tightly around just the stalk. Back on the handle outside the body, the distance from the safety mark will be considerably longer than the expected 8 or 9 millimeters.
Oh, wow.
Imagine you are the assistant in this room. You look down at your hand, see that the physical measurement doesn't match the doctor's visual estimate, and you immediately know something is wrong.
That simple marker tells the team to stop, open the snare, and think twice before applying any high-voltage current. It completely avoids what could be a catastrophic injury to healthy tissue. It's just brilliant.
It really is.
So let's assume the math checks out. They have lassoed only the stalk of the polyp. The next question is, where exactly do you squeeze the loop to make the cut? because my immediate instinct would be to push the loop all the way down to the base, right against the colon wall, and cut it flush so you get the whole thing out.
That instinct is exactly what the source warns against in the strongest possible terms.
Right.
Yes. Cutting at the base of the stalk is incredibly dangerous. We have to remember the anatomy of the gastrointestinal tract. The wall of the colon is shockingly thin. We're talking about a tissue thickness of only 3 to 5 millimeters in some places.
3 to 5 millimeters, that's thinner than a standard pencil.
With a wall that thin, if you apply intense heat and electrical current right at the base of the polyp, that thermal energy doesn't just stay in the stalk, it radiates downward.
Into the wall itself.
Exactly. At a cellular level, that residual heat cooks the tissue, causing what is called a transmural thermal injury. The burn travels completely through that thin colon wall. It can cause a delayed perforation, meaning days later, the weakened, burned tissue gives way and a hole opens up in the patient's colon.
Aside from the thermal damage, the source also mentions a mechanical danger with cutting at the base involving the blood vessels.
Yes, if you sever that thick stalk completely flush with the flat wall, the large blood vessels inside it can retract. Because they're under tension, they snap back like a rubber band, pulling deep into the colon wall itself.
Oh, that sounds awful.
It is. If that severed vessel starts bleeding, the doctor cannot easily reach it with clips or tools because it has retreated into the tissue. The solution to both the thermal danger and the retraction danger is to place the snare right in the middle of the stalk.
You leave a little stump.
Right.
That way, the heat stays far away from the colon wall, and if the vessel bleeds, you have a physical stump you can clamp down on with a medical clip. It makes perfect sense. But that brings us to the physics of the current itself, and the source outlines an absolutely fascinating phenomenon called the counterburn.
This is where understanding the flow of electricity is paramount. You have to visualize the environment again. We are in the sigmoid colon, which is quite narrow. We have a large polyp with a big, bulbous head. In that tight space, the head of the polyp is very likely going to be resting against the opposite wall of the colon.
Because the electricity comes out of the wire loop, travels through the polyp tissue, and wants to find its way to that grounding pad on the patient's back to complete the circuit.
Yes. Here is where current density becomes the deciding factor between a safe procedure and a severe injury. If the large head of the polyp has a broad, flat contact against the opposite wall of the colon, the situation is actually safe.
Okay, why is that safe?
Because the contact area is very broad, the electricity spreads out and disperses safely as it leaves the polyp. The highest concentration of electrical energy, the narrowest point in the circuit, will remain the tight wire loop around the stalk. That's where the heat will concentrate, and that's where the cut will happen safely.
I think I need a visual for that. If current density is the issue, what happens if the polyp head is just barely touching the opposite wall at one tiny pinpoint spot?
Think of it like this. Imagine someone stepping on your foot wearing a completely flat sneaker.
Sure.
The force is distributed across the whole shoe, so it doesn't hurt much. Now imagine that same person, with the exact same weight, stepping on your foot with a sharp stiletto heel. All of that energy is funneled into one tiny point, and it causes immense damage. The electricity acts the exact same way.
Oh, wow. All that electrical current trying to leave the polyp funnels into that one tiny point of contact.
Exactly. The current density at that pinpoint becomes incredibly high. The electricity creates intense heat, not just at the snare, but at that tiny spot where the polyp touches the healthy wall. This results in a counterburn. The doctor accidentally burns a hole in the opposite side of the colon without even touching it with a tool.
Which is terrifying. But the physical workaround they use to prevent this is surprisingly simple. The source calls it out. The doctor has to constantly jiggle the snare.
Right, jiggling.
They move the tool in and out slightly during the procedure. This ensures that the head of the polyp is constantly shifting its position and brushing against the wall, rather than resting fixed on one single point.
It keeps the energy safely dispersed. While they are managing that, they also have to be hyper-aware of their surroundings. If there happens to be a medical clip left over from a previous procedure nearby, they absolutely must ensure the polyp doesn't touch it.
Because the electricity would arc right through that metal clip and severely burn the adjacent tissue.
Precisely.
There's one more physics warning that really stood out, which is the danger of tenting. When you lasso the polyp, the human instinct might be to pull back hard to really get a good grip on it and lift it away from the wall. But the source says do not over-tent it.
Right. If you pull the snare up too hard toward the center of the colon, you stretch the tissue of the stalk. You are physically pulling the colon wall upwards, like a tent. When you stretch that tissue, the stalk below the snare becomes incredibly thin.
And as we just learned with the stiletto heel analogy, electricity loves narrow points.
If you thin out the stalk below the snare by pulling too hard, you inadvertently move the point of maximum current density down toward the base.
Oh, I see.
The cut will happen where the tissue is thinnest, meaning you might end up cutting right at the dangerous base of the stalk, despite placing your snare in the middle. The electrical current will literally outsmart your placement.
Wow. Okay, so we have the right settings, we've checked our safety marker, we're positioned in the middle of the stalk, we're jiggling to prevent a counterturn, and we aren't pulling too hard. Now we finally arrive at the core choreography, the actual moment of reception. This is a true dual control operation.
It is entirely reliant on perfect teamwork. The endoscopist, the doctor looking at the screen, is the one who steps on the blue pedal to deliver the electrical current. But it is the assistant who actually physically pulls the slider to close the snare and make the cut.
It's like one person working the gas pedal while a totally different person works the steering wheel. The assistant's role is massive here, particularly when it comes to the speed of the squeeze. Getting it wrong has severe consequences in both directions. Let's start with what happens if the assistant closes the snare too fast.
If they pull that slider back rapidly, the thin wire acts exactly like a cheese wire. It will mechanically shear right through the thick stalk before the electrical current has had enough time to heat up and coagulate those large blood vessels.
And that leads to...
The result is immediate, severe, and potentially life-threatening bleeding right there on the table.
So too fast is clearly bad. If the assistant gets overly cautious and closes it too slowly, what happens then?
Closing the loop too slowly allows excessive electrical current to pass through the tissue for too long. This causes overbaking. The tissue experiences excessive charring and deep coagulation.
You want it sealed, but I'm guessing you don't want it completely destroyed.
Right. If it is overcoagulated, a heavy, brittle scab forms over the stump. That might look perfectly fine during the procedure, but a few days later, while the patient is recovering at home, that heavy scab can slough off prematurely, exposing the unhealed blood vessels underneath.
Oh, no.
This results in delayed bleeding, which is a massive emergency because the patient is no longer safely in the hospital.
The assistant has to find this absolute Goldilocks zone. Not too fast, not too slow. The source emphasizes that the assistant isn't just standing there mindlessly pulling a lever on command. They have to be an active participant.
The assistant must be watching the monitor just as intently as the doctor. They have to watch the visual effects of the current going through the stalk. They have to observe the tissue turning white as it coagulates, watch the cut happening in real time, and physically adjust the speed of their hand on the slider, millimeter by millimeter, to match what the electricity is doing on the screen.
That is incredible.
It requires immense practice and physical intuition to get that feedback loop right.
But even with all of this perfect physics and perfect choreography, the ultimate rule of medical preparation is that you always prepare for the worst. The source wraps up the procedural steps with a hard line on emergency prep. If immediate bleeding does happen, if that wire cuts too fast, or a vessel retracts, the team cannot be caught off guard.
The transcript is very explicit about this. The team must have an emergency kit already prepared and physically in the room on the back table before the procedure even begins. This includes epinephrine injection needles, hemostatic clips, and endo loops.
Let's quickly define those for anyone who isn't a medical professional.
Epinephrine is essentially adrenaline. Injecting it around the bleed causes the blood vessels to constrict and slow the bleeding. Hemostatic clips are microscopic bear traps that the doctor can deploy to clamp a severed vessel shut. And an endo loop is a tiny, deployable nylon lasso used to tie off a bleeding stump like a tourniquet.
The exact quote that stuck with me from the source was, "Going out of the room to search for equipment during a bleed is not a good idea."
Which is putting it mildly.
Which feels like the understatement of the century. You have a patient actively bleeding from a large artery in their colon. You cannot have a nurse running down the hall to check a supply closet. Every single tool must be at arm's reach.
It underscores the sheer intensity of the environment. In a bleeding emergency inside the colon, every single second counts.
What does this all mean for you, the listener? We've taken a journey through what sounds on paper like a routine task, removing a polyp. But as we've seen from Dr. Raju's transcript, it is actually a high-stakes masterclass in electrical physics, spatial geometry, and unspoken, perfectly timed team choreography. The amazing thing is, the source notes that perforation, The absolute worst case scenario is actually incredibly rare, as long as these strict principles are followed. Snare in the middle of the stock, tight loop checked against the safety marker, the exact correct speed of the squeeze, and constant visual monitoring of the current.
It really is a marvel of applied science. The level of granular control required over unseen forces like current density and thermal radiation is staggering. But if we look beyond the procedure itself, I think this deeply human element raises a fascinating question about the future of this field.
Oh, what are you thinking?
Consider the rapid pace at which artificial intelligence and robotics are advancing in medicine today. We are already seeing robotic surgical assistants that can perform with superhuman precision.
That's very true.
It makes you wonder, how long will it be until an AI algorithm is integrated into these electrosurgical units? An algorithm that can instantly calculate the exact density of the polyp tissue, perfectly modulate the wattage in milliseconds, and completely automate the speed of the squeeze to eliminate human error.
That's wild to think about.
If that happens, will we lose this incredible, hard-won human intuition entirely? Or will the unpredictable nature of the human body always require that steady, experienced hand pulling the slider?
That is an incredible point to leave on, the race between automated algorithms and irreplaceable human intuition in the operating room. Thank you for joining us as we unpacked this source material today. We hope this deep dive gave you a whole new appreciation for the hidden mechanics of medicine. We'll see you next time.